Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. In this issue, we are delving into Oscar Wilde. Wilde was a British writer who dabbled in playwriting, poetry, novels, and essays. He is known for numerous famous quotes, such as "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. I can resist anything except temptation, and only shallow people do not judge by appearances." In addition to his famous quotes, there are also anecdotes about Wilde. When he visited the United States, customs officers asked if he had anything to declare, to which he famously replied, "I have nothing to declare but my genius." Whether this story is true or not, it fits with Wilde's flamboyant style. As he once said, the first duty in life is to assume a pose. What the second duty is, no one has as yet discovered. He also believed that, more than creating works, an artist's most important task is to craft their own legend. Wilde indeed became a legendary figure in his own right. Some statistics suggest that he is the most widely read British writer after Shakespeare. He was a brilliant student at Oxford and achieved success at a young age. However, at the age of 41, he was convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His life and reputation were ruined, and he died in poverty in Paris in 1900. His grave in Paris features a sculpture, inspired by the imagery in his work The Sphinx, depicting a small sphinx-like figure. If you visit Wilde's grave, you will always find many red lipstick marks on the sculpture, a way people show their respect through kisses. The author of this biography is Richard Ellmann, who studied at Yale University and Trinity College Dublin and later became a professor at Harvard, Yale, and Oxford. This biography of Wilde was Ellmann's final book. He passed away after completing it. He divided the biography into 2 volumes, Towards the Light, covering Wilde's life until the age of 41, and Against the Light, describing the bleak years of Wilde's trial, imprisonment, and the years that followed his release. This interpretation is also divided into 2 parts, with the first part focusing on Towards the Light. In 1854, Wilde was born into a wealthy and successful family in Dublin, Ireland. His father was a doctor known for his eloquence, and his mother was a poet who enjoyed socializing. His parents loved hosting parties at home. From his father, he inherited his gift of gab, and from his mother, his cheerful disposition. Even at a young age, he had a penchant for elegant attire. When he was around 10, he learned that British legal cases were often titled the Queen v. someone. He declared to his friends that one day he would be the defendant in the Queen v. Wilde. Wilde graduated from a public school in Dublin and then attended Trinity College Dublin, where he excelled academically. Before the age of 20, he earned a scholarship to study classical literature at Oxford University. He had excellent academic performance and a talent for spending money. He purchased items like a blue goblet, decorative candlesticks, various wine glasses, and gilded breakfast china. He bought these to entertain his fellow students with wine in his dorm room, which he adorned with lilies and various decorations. Wilde's major was classical literature, and he had a taste for aestheticism. His aestheticism extended beyond literary theory and poetry into his love for ornate decoration, extravagant clothing, and accruing debt with tailors and jewelers to support his lavish lifestyle. In fact, his spending habits got him into trouble, to the extent that the university had to intervene and request repayment. Until his father's death, Wilde didn't worry about money, but after his father's passing, he faced financial difficulties. He had to consider finding a job to make a living. His mother wrote to him, suggesting that he didn't need to find a humble job, and instead, he could sell the house his father left him to comfortably live for 10 years. Wasn't that a good idea? In theory, the inheritance left by his father would have been sufficient for him to live comfortably if he had been frugal. However, Wilde was an extravagant spender. He desired luxurious clothing, exquisite china, and carpets. After graduating from college, he couldn't secure the job he had applied for. So, he sold his family's house and arrived in London with nearly £3,000, intending to conquer the city with his talent. He initially made connections within the social circles, where he met the painter Whistler, the Prince of Wales, and several actresses. He wrote poetry and sent flowers to these actresses, and even had some romantic scandals with a few socialites. One of these actresses, named Sarah Bernhard, despite facing financial difficulties, continued to live a glamorous life. She always advised young people to spend their money boldly, believing that money is meant to be spent. Wilde had a close relationship with Sarah, and it said he learned vocal techniques from her, honing a good speaking voice that would later be of great help in his speeches. His interactions with these actresses helped him find his professional direction. He decided to write plays for them and become a playwright. Wilde's flamboyant lifestyle made him the subject of ridicule by some. A playwright based a comedy called Patience on Wilde and Whistler, mocking them and the aesthetic movement. On one occasion, Wilde met this playwright at a dinner, and after talking for half an hour at the table, the playwright said, "I wish I were as good at conversation as you, but I prefer to keep my mouth shut as a virtue." To which Wilde responded, "That's very selfish of you. I can give up the pleasure of talking, but I cannot deny others the pleasure of listening." Wilde had a gift for conversation, and during his time at Oxford, he honed his conversational skills with professors. He was knowledgeable, an excellent conversationalist, and could effortlessly spin a good yarn. Before Patience premiered, Wilde wrote a letter to the playwright saying, "I hear your new play is about to be performed. Please reserve a box for me. I hope your play will make me laugh heartily." This was Wilde's attitude towards facing ridicule. He knew that his mannerisms and way of speaking would certainly invite mockery, but he welcomed it as part of his plan. He understood that a good reputation and a bad reputation are like twin brothers. He could first have a bad reputation and then hope to gain a good one. In 1881, at the age of 26, Wilde published his first poetry collection, entirely at his own expense. He used handmade Dutch paper for printing, and the cover was made of white vellum. The first edition had 750 copies, titled simply Poems. He sent this collection to many prominent figures. He was well aware that being a non-conforming young poet was risky. To establish himself in society, he needed to leverage his oratory skills, mix with the leisured class, and mingling with the affluent upper class required money. To maintain the lifestyle of the leisured class, Wilde mortgaged an inherited house and sold a piece of property in Dublin. He completed his first play, Vera, or The Nihilists, commonly known as Vera, but no actors were prepared to perform it. At this time, he received a letter from a theater owner in New York. The satirical play Patience, which mocked aestheticism, was a success in New York. The Americans knew about aestheticism, with its emphasis on fashionable attire, Victorian furniture, beautiful wallpaper, and Japanese screens, but they had never seen an aesthete in person. When the theater owner heard about Wilde, a flamboyant dresser, strolling around with flowers, and a poet with some renown, he decided to bring him to the United States to give a lecture tour and promote Patience to show American audiences what aesthetes were like. Lecture tours in that era had both the purpose of spreading ideas and an element of performance. American scholars like Emerson and Thoreau had earned some money and fame through lectures. Wilde reached an agreement with the New York theater owner. After covering room and board expenses, they would split the profits from the lectures. Wilde diligently prepared for his lectures. He first had a green fur coat tailored with buttons in the shape of pansies and a new-style overcoat. He also asked the American ambassador in London to write recommendation letters for various American notables. He built momentum by publicizing his upcoming trip to America, where he would deliver a series of romantic lectures on modern life and introduce his poetry. On January 2, 1882, Oscar Wilde disembarked from the Arizona in New York. Reporters boarded a small boat to interview him. They saw Wilde dressed in a green overcoat with a sealskin collar, a large round-top hat, a sky-blue necktie, and a pair of shiny black leather shoes. He wore a massive signet ring on his finger and spoke with a rhythmic cadence. He told the reporters, "I have come to America to preach the gospel of beauty, for man desires beauty. Aestheticism is ridiculed and mocked because the blind cannot see the beautiful." On January 5, a writer couple in New York hosted Wilde. After dinner, Wilde, along with about 10 American friends, went to the theater to watch Patience. The character named Bunthorne in the play was dressed like Wilde, and when Bunthorne made his entrance, the audience turned their attention to the box where Wilde was seated. The play was meant to satirize Wilde and aestheticism, but Wilde garnered attention from it. He commented that this play was one of the ways mediocrity pays homage to genius. He believed that if you can face criticism and ridicule with the same grace as he did, rather than being resentful, it can be an excellent way to navigate life. The more you are talked about, the more you long to be talked about, and reputation follows accordingly. Upon his arrival in New York, Wilde received hundreds of invitations to various dinners and social events. He became a social star. On January 9th, he delivered his first lecture in the United States, dressed in a deep purple coat, knee-length shorts, black knee-high socks, buckle shoes, and a cloak with a light purple satin lining. His cuffs and the bow tie at his collar had ornate frills. When he took the stage, he was also draped in a cape. His attire complemented his speech, where he spoke about beautifying the inner self through external beautification and pursued new themes in poetry and new artistic forms. He also talked about patience and referred to satirical literature as shameful and impoverished, a tribute from mediocrity to genius. He mentioned that having an opposite opinion from 3/4 of the British public on any issue is the primary sign of a healthy mind. His first lecture generated $1,211 in ticket sales, with even standing room tickets selling out. While some people were unimpressed with Wilde and his lectures, many more people eagerly looked forward to hearing him speak in social gatherings. During his time in the United States, Wilde met the poet Walt Whitman and several female stars whom he convinced to act in his play Vera. He also encountered the writer Henry James, who disliked Wilde's demeanor, describing him as a foolish idiot, a base scoundrel, and a filthy beast. Wilde's tour of America was a whirlwind, from Boston to Chicago, and everywhere he went, he was the center of attention. Initially scheduled to end his lecture tour in April, it was so successful that he began a second round in May and a third round in July. In total, Wilde delivered over 200 lectures in the United States. In addition to the topic The English Renaissance, he composed 2 new lectures, one titled The House Beautiful and the other The Decorative Arts, both focusing on the practical application of aesthetics. After his lecture tour concluded in October 1882, Wilde stayed in New York for 2 more months, continuing his social engagements, before returning to London in early 1883. His lecture tour in America was exceedingly successful, and Wilde gained international acclaim. He had white managers and black servants tending to him, stayed in the most luxurious hotels, and visited the wealthiest families. Upon returning to London, he struggled to adjust to a more ordinary life and quickly departed for Paris. There, he resided at the Voltaire Hotel on the left bank of the Seine, where he continued to write plays and engage in social activities. In 3 months in Paris, he spent all the money he had earned in America, and then returned to London. Back in London, he borrowed £1,200 and re-entered social circles. At this time, he began considering marriage. The woman he was introduced to was named Constance. Constance's grandfather posed 2 questions. 1. How much wealth do you have? 2. How much debt do you have? Wilde replied, I owe others £1,200, but I have already started repaying it with the money from my lectures. Oscar Wilde and Constance married on May 29, 1884. They rented a house and used the £5,000 they received from Constance's grandfather to decorate it. As Wilde had a lecture titled The House Beautiful, their marital home had to be perfectly transformed. Constance was fluent in French and Italian and enjoyed reading, leading to a harmonious family life. Though their income was often tight, they had 2 sons in quick succession. Wilde continued to earn money through his lectures, covering topics such as the value of art in modern life and dress. He also wrote book reviews for newspapers, served as an editor for a fashion magazine, and was the chief editor of a magazine called The Woman's World. Wilde played the role of a good husband and father for 2 years, but he grew somewhat impatient. In 1886, while at Oxford University, Wilde met Robert Ross, who would become his first homosexual partner. The year 1891 can be seen as Wilde's miracle year. During this year, he published 2 collections of stories, a collection of essays, completed his first successful play, and released the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Picture of Dorian Gray is Wilde's only full-length novel. It tells the story of a young man named Dorian Gray, who has a portrait painted. Afterward, Dorian engages in cruel and immoral acts while the portrait gradually becomes more corrupt and aged, reflecting his sins. The real Dorian remains forever young and unspoiled. Wilde's choice of a portrait as the central theme for his novel is quite fitting. He had painted numerous self-portraits, and was very concerned with his image. During his time at Oxford, he sported long wavy hair. When he went to Paris, he had his hair cut short and styled in the Roman fashion. In London, he dressed like a dandy, while in America, his attire was even more extravagant. After his return to London, he gravitated towards more elegant attire. He believed that the self possessed multiple possibilities, and one's life should encompass the expression of these potentialities. In one of his essays, he stated that aesthetics is superior to ethics, as it belongs to a more spiritual realm. Perceiving the beauty of things represents the highest level one can attain. In the course of personal development, the sense of color is more important than the sense of right and wrong. According to Wilde, freedom in art and individual expression held more significance than morality. It's in this context that we can understand why The Picture of Dorian Gray attracted many readers at the time, with some young people repeatedly reading the novel and detecting its erotic and homosexual undertones. One of the book's famous lines is, "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it." While debating the book, Wilde offered another memorable quote, "There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written." Wilde held a somewhat hostile view of the general public. He once said, "There are three kinds of despots. There is the despot who tyrannizes over the body. There is the despot who tyrannizes over the soul. There is the despot who tyrannizes over the soul and body alike. The first is called the prince. The second is called the pope. The third is called the people." He also defended sin, claiming it was a strong form of individualism that saved people from being typecast and led to higher moral standards and the rejection of current ethical views. To society, sin represented a form of self-expression and aimed to liberate one's personality. Understanding these viewpoints helps us comprehend not only his novels but also the trial he would soon face. On April 19, 1893, Wilde attended a dinner party where a palm reader gave readings before the meal. The palm reader sat behind a curtain, and guests extended their hands to be read. When Wilde offered his hand, the palm reader remarked that his left and right hands had significant differences. The left hand foretold success, while the right hand indicated impending destruction. The left hand was that of a king, but the right hand signified a king who would fall into exile. Wilde, being quite superstitious, inquired when this destruction would happen. The fortune-teller replied, "Around the age of 40. At the time, Wilde was 38, at the height of his fame with successful plays in London. Alright, this is the content of the first part, covering Wilde's upstream period. He was born into an upper-class intellectual family, obtained a degree from Oxford, self-published a poetry collection, and became a representative of the aesthetic movement. He once said, "My ambition is far more than just writing poetry. I want my life to be a work of art. I know the value of a good poem, as well as the value of a rose, a bottle of fine wine, a tie, and a fine meal." At 26, he embarked on a lecture tour in the United States, spending a significant amount of time and money on socializing. He first became a socialite and then a successful writer. Next, we enter the second part to examine Wilde's dramatic and tumultuous later life. A key figure influencing Wilde's later life was Lord Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie. He studied at Oxford, where Wilde was his senior. They met in 1892 and quickly became involved. Looking at photos, Bosie was a handsome young man of shorter stature, while Wilde was tall and slightly portly. Yet, Bosie had a strong hold over Wilde, as he was able to extract money from him. Wilde's first homosexual lover was Robert Ross, and Bosie once wrote to Ross, stating that demanding money from Wilde was a delightful thing. For both of them, it was a sweet humiliation and great pleasure. Being financially supported was one of the pleasures of being loved, and Wilde spent a considerable sum on Bosie. Reportedly, between 1892 and 1895, Wilde and Bosie spent £5,000 on dining, which averaged about £40 per week. At that time, £1 was equivalent to about £70 today, so spending that much in a week was extravagant. During this period, Wilde's life seemed to be on the edge, as he left his wife and children to stay with Bosie in hotels and became involved with several young men through Bosie. Some of his love letters ended up in the wrong hands and were used for extortion, forcing Wilde to pay to retrieve the letters. Bosie's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, was a proud man who was infuriated by Bosie's association with Wilde. Their relationship was strained, and Bosie appeared to use Wilde to provoke his father. Throughout their relationship, Wilde repeatedly discussed breaking up with Bosie, believing that they were ruining each other's lives and that complete separation was the sensible choice. But when it came to matters of the heart, rationality often took a back seat. Once Bosie repented and claimed he had been in the wrong, they quickly reconciled. Wilde was entangled with Bosie while writing plays such as Salome and An Ideal Husband. He likely did not enjoy this latter part of his life, which was somewhat absurd and lacked aesthetic style. On February 28, 1895, Wilde went to a social club where the Marquis of Queensberry had left a card with the inscription for Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite, accusing Wilde of being a sodomite and a pederast. Wilde decided to sue Queensberry for libel. Some friends advised Wilde not to proceed with the lawsuit but to withdraw it and flee London for Paris to avoid trouble. However, Bosie disagreed and encouraged Wilde to sue his own father. Before the trial, Wilde was preparing to defend his works, asserting that he was not a corrupter of morals. However, Queensberry's side had already compiled a list of over a dozen young boys who accused Wilde of seducing them. In court, Wilde initially appeared arrogant. When the lawyer asked if the picture of Dorian Gray was a perverted book, Wilde replied that this was the view of barbarians and illiterates. He said it was incredibly unintelligent to the unenlightened. The lawyer then inquired whether an ordinary person might find something wrong with Dorian Gray's sexual orientation. Wilde responded, "I don't know anything about the views of ordinary people." He probably expected the trial to be decided based on eloquence and wit. After the Marquis of Queensberry was acquitted, Wilde hadn't fully grasped the situation. He wrote a letter to a newspaper, stating, "I alone stand in the dock. I am not influenced by the expectations of success. Disgrace does not terrify me. I think my stand is right, and I am quite reckless of the consequences." At this point, he still had a chance to escape. Nevertheless, he chose to remain in London. In April 1895, the grand jury decided to prosecute Wilde, who was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in prison on charges of gross indecency and other acts contrary to public decency. Newspapers always find it exciting when a celebrity goes to court, and they condemned Wilde. Bosie escaped to France, hoping to publish an article to defend Wilde. He wanted to start the article with a quote from a love letter Wilde wrote to him in prison, in which Wilde stated, "I write this letter to assure you of my immortal and eternal love for you." Bosie said that Wilde's love for him originated from a pure physical adoration of beauty and elegance. This article, rather than being a defense of Wilde, was more of a boast, suggesting that Wilde's downfall was because of his love for Bosie. Wilde's letter prevented Bosie from publishing this. He realized that his young lover was shallow, lacking empathy, and treating Wilde's disgrace as an opportunity to write an article. In contrast, Wilde's wife, Constance, provided him with significant comfort. Initially, Constance had intended to divorce Wilde, but she withdrew her divorce request, visited him in prison, and promised that after his release, he could return to the family, and they could live together again. Wilde endured rough food, diarrhea, insomnia, and various illnesses during his time in prison. The most harrowing episode was when he was transferred from Wandsworth Prison to Reading Prison. He was handcuffed, dressed in prison clothes, and waited on a platform at a small train station. A group of people recognized him and spat at him, mocking him. Wilde said that after this incident, he cried every day at the same time for a year, equal to the length of time he had waited on the platform. However, in Reading Prison, he received some preferential treatment. The governor noticed that he couldn't perform physical labor and assigned him to work in the garden and the library. He received many books and read extensively, bringing some change to the prison library. In May 1897, Wilde completed his 2-year sentence and was released. Instead of returning to his wife, he went to a small coastal town in France to be with Bosie. He said that he only had the motivation to continue writing when he was with Bosie. In the eyes of his family and friends, this was Wilde's second fall. He had let down everyone's expectations. Constance believed that Wilde's choice of Bosie was continuing to associate with someone of ill repute, and she decided not to provide him with a weekly allowance anymore. In Bosie's mother's view, her son continuing to associate with Wilde was unforgivable, and she issued an ultimatum. She would cut off Bosie's financial support if they continued to see each other. If they wrote a letter of repentance, promising not to meet again, she would pay off Bosie's debts and give Wilde an additional £200. These two prodigal spenders contemplated whether to accept this offer. Bosie had promised to stay with Wilde, but he had no money and no means to earn it. Wilde was no longer the wealthy and famous playwright, and he had no friends. After serving a prison sentence, he could no longer support Bosie. After a brief reunion in Naples, Italy, the two separated. This post-prison reunion, in a way, was to confirm one of Wilde's conclusions: people often have to kill the thing they love. Wilde's last 2 years were spent in France, where he idled away his time. He told friends that he wanted to write but never actually started. He knew deep down that he would never write again. He lived in a hotel in Paris, accumulating significant debt. One day, he bumped into an opera singer on the streets of Paris and said, "Madame Melba, I am Oscar Wilde. I am going to do a dreadful thing. I am going to ask you for money." The opera singer, Madame Melba, emptied her pockets and gave all her money to Wilde, recalling the time they first met in London many years ago. At that time, Wilde had said, "Ah, Madame Melba, I am the Lord of Language, and you are the Queen of Song. I am going to write a sonnet for you." The poet started asking for money, which characterized the bleak final phase of Wilde's life. In January 1900, the Marquess of Queensberry passed away, and Bosie inherited an estate of nearly £20,000. Wilde wrote to Bosie, hoping to get help from his former lover, but Bosie did not provide any money to Wilde. On November 30th of that year, Wilde passed away at the Alsace Hotel in Paris, with his first homosexual lover, Robert Ross, by his side. This marked the dramatic downward spiral of Wilde's later life, as he was tried, imprisoned for 2 years, and never recovered, leading to his untimely death. The essence of Oscar Wilde has been covered. Let's summarize the key points of this episode. First, Oscar Wilde's major works include the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray and plays such as Salome and The Importance of Being Earnest. However, what has been most widely disseminated are his famous quotes. Wilde once said, "When I was young, I thought that money was the most important thing in life. Now that I am old, I know it is." He also said, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." Another memorable quote is, "When one is in trouble, one should never be sarcastic. It is a low form of wit, and particularly trying to friends." In comparison to his literary works, these quotes have done more to perpetuate his fame. Second, Oscar Wilde was skilled at using the media to gain notoriety. He understood that to achieve fame and fortune, one had to mingle with the wealthy and influential, becoming a celebrity in the leisure class. He also knew how to use the attacks and ridicule from others to his advantage. He recognized that bad reputation and good reputation often go hand in hand, and that one must learn to leverage a bad reputation to gain a good one. Third, Wilde's pursuit of beauty extended beyond his literary and artistic creations to his lifestyle. He decorated his house, dressed stylishly, and spent money extravagantly. He believed that aesthetics held a higher place than morality. He considered sin a strong form of individualism, a means of liberating people from conventional types. His personal experiences, particularly his 1895 trial for homosexual acts and gross indecency, highlight how times have changed, as the offenses for which he was convicted are no longer considered crimes in modern-day Britain. Wilde indeed succeeded in freeing many people from conformity, which is one of the reasons he continues to be admired by subsequent generations. The controversies that surrounded him in his lifetime and beyond also indirectly attest to his ability to shape himself into a legend. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.